Charles Byrd, Mary Our Queen Catholic Church, and this is the second in a four-part series of history of the church, and we're going now for the years 500 to roughly 1,000. Is that good?
Perfect, thank
you.
All
right. So, this is just to remind you where we left off. Constantinople is huge, it's metropolitan, it's sophisticated, all the power is there, it's where all the money is, it is, impregnable. It's this fortress that you cannot at all take. And it's an imperial Christian capital. It's not where the Holy Father is. The Holy Father is in Rome, but it's where the emperor is. So in Christian Europe and Africa and Asia at this time, everyone would be praying for both the Pope in Rome and the emperor in Constantinople, the new Rome. But there's a sense of things changing, right? Because the power structure in the East is more controlled, more organized, and what's happening in the West is things are falling apart. There's some history is important to know. Look at a map when you do history. And one of the things that we need to pay particular attention to are the Alps, because heretofore everything has been kind of sub-alpine, or it's been not trans-Alp, but sort of in the Mediterranean basin. But we're going to see a kind of shift of focus to above the Alps, and in this next 5 centuries. In the east, of course, there are the Urals, and they run through Russia. And again, as Americans, I don't know about you, but I always think of what people say is Central Europe as Eastern Europe. I don't think of Russia as Europe at all. But it is technically, at least parts of it are. So the Urals are in the east, but again, that's kind of far from our focus. In the west, we have the Pyrenees. And that's going to also be a set of mountains that makes a difference in the story of our unfolding of the church's next 5 centuries of history. Because what's going on is, as we said before, the barbarians are invading, and by and large, they're setting up camp in what had been the Roman Empire in places north of the Alps. But after the empire begins to collapse in the west, those places become less imperial and more violent. And so the barbarians come in. And so we have a very important event with the baptism of Clovis. And what's important for us to understand in all of this is that very often the barbarians were Arians. The barbarians were heretics. So they were not necessarily heathen, although some of them had been, but some of them were actually a kind of heretical Christian. And so what happens with the baptism of Clovis is he actually is baptized Catholic. He's baptized in the Orthodox faith, right? In the Trinitarian faith. And that makes a big difference in how the next 500 years unfolds. So that's a kind of pivotal moment in church history. Because we've seen that elsewhere things are falling apart, but here's a glimmer of hope. A glimmer of hope. And we look at Pope Boniface II. He's kind of another pivotal person because he was the first Germanic pope. Again, all the popes have been they've been Greek, or they have been African, or they have been sort of Italian, in that some of them have been Spain, and they've been kind of in the lower parts, right? But this is the first Germanic pope, Boniface II. One of the things that we should pay attention to is the year 536. The year 536 is the worst year in history. It's been called And what happens is there's a volcano that erupts, and it plunges the whole world, not just the West, but basically the upper hemisphere, into a dark period of time where you could almost not even see, you would see the sun, but it would look like the moon. And we were in summertime, and it was 36 degrees. And it was snowing in places where it shouldn't have snowed. And that brought about a great plague. People were very, they thought the world was kind of coming to an end. And so that begins, the barbarians are coming in, the empire is falling apart, and then there's this terrible time of darkness, which begins what we kind of refer to as the Dark Ages. And thereafter there's the plague of Justinian, and that's the bubonic plague, and it comes in and wipes out so many people. So, we have the Goths and the barbarians coming in and sacking Rome and taking over the old empire. And we have these great sort of, as it were, kind of acts of God, acts of nature, these things that, nobody understood. It couldn't be prevented, but they made for a very dark period of history. But in the midst of that, of course, there are these still ongoing things, like Hagia Sophia is finally built in the year 537. That's the great basilica that's still standing now, a mosque in Constantinople. But this is really beginning sort of our Middle Ages period, right? Now, one of the things you need to know is in the old empire, where the emperors, sometimes the emperors were heretics that caused huge troubles. Then there would be another emperor who would call the ecumenical council, and then they would try to figure it all out, and then there might be another fight, and then they had to call another ecumenical council. So in the East, and you see it even today, like Vladimir Putin sort of tries to play the czar, right? In the East, the person who's in charge of the government is kind of in charge of the church, and that's happening in the East in part because that's where the power is, that's where the emperor is in Constantinople. And so sometimes you've got great, holy, Orthodox bishops and emperors, and sometimes you have not so great. And that throws the whole system into a mess. So we go through a period of time where there's a great deal of Arian heretics, and then there's Nestorians, and we talk a little bit about them. They get kicked out. Sometimes they go beyond the empire, and so the church, the Nestorians, went all the way to China. But they didn't have a proper sort of Trinitarian Orthodox faith, but they existed. There was recently, about a year ago, they discovered this mosaic, and it's in the Holy Land, and it's a 1,500-year-old mosaic, and it comes from this period of time. And on the mosaic, the church is gone, but the floor, the mosaic is still there, and it said Constantine built this, right? And it's to honor Peter, the Prince of the Apostles. So you see there in that same mosaic, you've kind of got the new power is shifted to the East, but there's still a reverence for the Pope in the West, in Rome. However, this is what's happening in Europe, in Western Europe. I mean, it's, like I said before, it's scrappy. Ours is kind of a scrappy, expression of the faith. Because, you see these beautiful basilicas, and the roofs have fallen in, and in the midst of the ruins, they're picking up pieces, and they're building some little fishing village, or farm village, or goat village, in the middle of what had been great imperial Rome in the West, and that's happening. And so you've got a change of systems. And these barbarians bring with them These Frankish people bring with them a different kind of political perspective. And Rome had kings way in its antiquity, but it had decided that kings were bad. Now, certainly, you're beginning to see clans with kings and earls and these kind of people who are coming in. And so the church is going to begin to evangelize these people, but it's going to change the political structure in the West. Because, again, in the East, the emperor is kind of supreme, but in the West, it's almost too far for his or her, the empress's power to really matter. And they just take their eyes basically off the West. And, and there's consequences to that. And the consequences are, this kind of new government and new nationalism that's forming above the Alps. But in the midst of all of that, there are these great missionaries like St. Benedict, like St. Martin, all of them, sort of the Irish missionaries. They're coming in and they're evangelizing where the economy and the government and the society is collapsing or changing, and where there are these new peoples. They're bringing the gospel to these new peoples. And the Franks are certainly one of the new people. So King Clovis, when he was baptized, his wife, I believe, is Clotilda, St. Clotilda, and she, a lot of times in this period of time, it's really interesting, the wives are the civilizing change. Because the new kings are seeking a kind of legitimacy and connection, and so they look to other Christianized groups because they want what that Christian group has, because the Christian group seems to have their act together. And so they will say, well, I want to marry into your dynasty. And so a woman, a young lady, will go, from France to England, where these barbarous Anglo-Saxons are, and she'll marry, St. Ethelbert or something, and Ethelbert. And he's a total pagan, but she brings a bishop with her, and she has Mass, and she sleeps with her husband, she has children, she wants her children baptized, she eventually convinces him to bring missionaries in, and that pattern is something that repeats. And so you see it kind of, the wives marry pagan kings and begin to bring not just the king, but the whole kingdom into the church, which I think is something we've kind of lost, unfortunately. Those queenly saints, I think, are really interesting. But in the middle of all of this comes something unexpected. And it comes out of Arabia, and it's Islam. And Islam is emerging out of Nestorianism. It's emerging from a kind of Christianity that represents, that appreciates Jesus, but does not accept him as God. And so you see this kind of morphing of this heresy into this new religion of Islam. So while the West is falling apart, while missionaries are being sent to try to convert these new pagans in the north of the Alps, from beyond the empire in the south come this new religion. And it's going to be a huge challenge to Christian civilization for the next, until I don't know, maybe 100 years from now. It still is a problem. It's still a challenge, right? Let's see. So, Islam is going to begin, Muslims are going to begin conquering. And what they're going to do is radically, this is why I say our perspective of history is often a Western European one, because they're going to take everything. They're going to take Christian Africa. They're going to take basically the Levant. They're going to eventually take Constantinople. They're going to press into Vienna. They're going to take the Hispania and the peninsula of Spain and Portugal. They're called a crescent, and the idea is the crescent will eventually become full, right, and take over the whole. But it kind of meets a difficulty with this scrappy Western Christianity. And so, it kind of takes over things that were sophisticated, that were more organized, that were more like, these places in like Alexandria in Africa was like the Manhattan, but Islam took it. But it couldn't take Tours, these little towns. So it's kind of an interesting perspective, and you just have to sort of imagine it growing and challenging, taking over, and changing the landscape of what the church, has the church saw herself. So you've got in Britain, the church is thriving, and a lot of times in Ireland, that's where the great intellectual center pivots. It pivots from this magnificent international city in Africa to these, sheep hills and cold places where monks live in rock huts. And how does that work? But that's where the intellectual sort of refocuses to the north, and it refocuses in an interesting way, and it changes things, it influences things, and it flavors things. And a lot of those, Europe falls basically into heresy, and so Irish or Celtic missionaries have to go from Ireland back to Europe to evangelize it. And again, that brings, with it a new richness. But it's interesting how heretofore everything, the West was kind of falling apart and looking to the old Christendom, sort of as, well, at least they've got their act together. Well, with Islam, suddenly the West is kind of on its own. And some of the people that are in this thing, it's too bad we can't go into all of these, like St. Isidore in Spain. I mean, they converted the Visigoths. So we say the creed every Sunday because of Israel and his brother, Leander, because they converted the Ostrogoths to Orthodox Catholic Christianity. And one of the things they did was that we're going to say that Nicene Creed at every Mass, so that, we sort of get it into their heads, this Orthodoxy. And we continue to do that today. So these things that happen in remote places in Spain or in England or in Ireland, they influence the whole of the Western expression of Christianity. See, Hilda, she is she's the abbess at the Abbot of Whitby. Again, she's from the royal family stock, and she does the biggest library in, I think, what is today England. And they come there, and that's kind of the Celtic calendar and the Roman calendar was a little different in how they celebrate Easter. And at Whitby, they choose to go Roman. But, when I say they're a little different, I mean, there might have been a different day on Easter, but it wasn't a different faith. So, but you're beginning to see kind of a normalization and a unification through ritual and through the international nature of Catholicism. So in 670, Islam has already conquered North Africa, but Constantinople is still this really impressive city. It just can't be conquered. The walls are too high. They have this super weapon called Greek fire, basically flame throwing on ships. And so, they're just, they managed to survive even though so much of the empire is wiped out, they're still hanging on. But it won't last, of course, right? So, now Islam fails to take Constantinople in 717, but it conquers Spain. And then there's Pelayo, the king, and the Battle of Covadonga, which is in Spain, and it's Galicia in the northern part of Spain. It's very Celtic. We don't often think of Spain as a Celtic place, but it's very Celtic. And that's the place where Catholicism survived. So, Islam took over almost all of the peninsula, but up in this tiny part of the mountains where nobody wanted to go because it was too cold and could grow almost nothing. That's where Catholics fled to. And from there they began the Reconquista, and they began to slowly push Islam out of Spain. There's a saying in Spain that, that Galicia is real Spain, as it were, right? And the rest of it is reconquered. And so you begin to see, and again, when you look at Spanish history, the Catholic history, it's like there's kingdoms and they're fighting each other. They have to eventually come together so that they can work together and begin to push out Islam. Battle of Charles Martel happens in the year 732, and that's very significant because Islam has come over the Pyrenees and they're attacking Tours, the great center of the cult of St. Martin. It's this huge place of learning. It's like, you would be like taking, I guess in Georgia would be taking Atlanta. It's like the prize. But they get defeated by Charles Martel. And Charles Martel, he is going to, of his lineage comes another Charles, who's called Charles the Great. And so you're going to begin to see the Carolingian Empire, which starts to build in what is today France and Germany. Meanwhile, Italy is a total political mess, right? So the Pope is down there going, oh, and he's sort of having to take over. He's having to try to run the place because there are all these cities that are turned into city-states and they're all fighting each other and it's just a political disaster. So again, Pope in Rome starts to look at Charlemagne, starts to look at what's going on north of the Alps and says, that's important. Those people have their act together. I need to sort of align myself with the Carolingians and with France. And there's a tradition in Europe that France is the eldest daughter of the church because of that. Because when everything's falling apart, when the empire isn't paying attention, when the Pope is all on his own and everything's falling apart, France and Charlemagne kind of rise to the front and come to the rescue. Now, just so that we don't stay entirely in the West, in the East there's something called iconoclasm, and that's where they start learning all the icons. And they're influenced by Muslims and sort of the strict kind of sense of not to depict anything. And it's interesting because one of the major heretics is the emperor, but his wife, meanwhile, Irene, she's a saint, and she's like hiding icons under her bed, so that when he dies, she can bring them out and have them repainted. It's these heresies. They're not just like us versus them. They're us versus us in many ways, even today. But that's one of the reasons we pulled together these ecumenical councils. It's like, okay, what are we going to do about iconography? Here's a little bit of Pelayo and Covadonga, and this part of Spain where Catholicism hung on in Asturias. And Asturias is that part of Galicia that I said, Asturias has never lost its faith. And it began the slow sort of reconquering of Spain, which took up until basically 1597. No, up until, when did Columbus sail?
1492.
1492. Basically, it was when they could finally say that Spain was reconquered, they sent Columbus to the west. It's almost the same year. Again, just trying to give you a sort of sense of things. You've got the Venerable Bede, who is writing history, and he's the reason we, in large part, he sort of standardized our dating system. So he's the reason we say AD or BC. And because he was such a historian, and there have been others who had used that dating, but he kind of made it universal, because everybody read Bede. He wrote a history on sort of the church in Britain, and he used the AD and BC dating. So you're starting to see, and again, it's so funny for us because Britain right now is such a Protestant place, a secular place, but we didn't understand that Catholicism was huge in England for 1,000 years. I mean, it was just so vital and so Catholic. It just sort of went off the rails with the Reformation. So now let's just look at this next slide. You've got sort of a sense of where Islam has taken over. Basically, the historical center of the church, Jerusalem, is surrounded, and Africa, the intellectual center of the church, is lost. And so you've got this kind of Western European phenomenon that is struggling to hang on and to sort of defend itself in the midst of all these sort of crises, really. And so this is kind of where we get the idea of Christendom, but keep in mind still, at this point, Constantinople, which is still standing, and Rome are still in communion, right? Now and then they go through a bitter fight and they'll go out of communion for a bit, but then, because they got a heretic for emperor, but then they come back. So, and still people in Europe will probably still be praying for the emperor in the East. However, now there's suddenly going to be a shift. Okay, so in the middle of all this, you've got people, the Vikings, they're coming in there, they're terrible. The Norsemen are terrible. When I say that, I have a lot of Viking blood in me. They were the worst. They killed indiscriminately. They burned books for the gold. I mean, they just brought utter and total complete chaos. So, these monks would not even have a weapon, because they had tried to build abbeys and monasteries on islands so that they would be away from the mainland. But now they were totally vulnerable to the Viking. And so you start to see funny things, like if you go to Wales, the Cathedral of St. David in Wales. It's like, why don't we put it on the hill? Why don't we put it under the hill? They would start to almost hide churches from the water to sort of keep it hard to find them. And you're starting to see a kind of, again, a scrappy hanging one, but it's not like what, we imagine with this glorious moment of fabulous architecture, and riches. It's more a sort of a bunch of boxers and, scrappy farmers sort of hanging on to their faith. thing about huge that happens in Maidenland is that Charlemagne is crowned the Holy Roman Emperor in the West. And he already is kind of actively in control of most of Northern Europe, above the Alps, even below the Alps. So it doesn't change any political reality, but it's a new name. And one of the things we need to know is that Rome went through periods of time when there would be an emperor in the east and the emperor in the west, even in imperial times. There had been an emperor in the east, but again, the emperor in the east was very often heretical. They took their eyes off of Rome, and so they're just, the Vatican is looking, I mean, the Pope is looking to Charlemagne and saying, we need structure, we need some kind of uniform, unity, building reality. And so on Christmas Day, Charlemagne is crowned at St. Peter's in the year 800. And after that, many kings and queens will thereafter be crowned on Christmas Day. It becomes kind of a sets a precedent. But it's important for us to keep in mind that the emperor is not like Stalin, right? He's not a dictator. He's not somebody who can force his will. He's kind of a unifying idea. Just like Rome is a unifying idea. Even still, like even in Washington, D.C., you know, when we see the buildings in Washington, D.C., they're designed to kind of have that Roman look to them. So the emperor, and the idea of the empire is, it is so that we can have peace and unity, but there would still be kings, there would still be petty, there would still be, you know, different divisions. So he's not making like a new nation. He's taking all of these political organizations and sort of puts them under an umbrella. So, the West kind of just gives, a little bit gives up on the East, to be honest. And Gregory the Great, he was the Pope in the late 500s, and he had been an ambassador to Constantinople. And he just said, we cannot keep looking to Constantinople to save us. And it takes another 2 centuries before Charlemagne is sort of seen as an answer to what's happening in Western Europe. Charlemagne has his capital in Aachen, and you can still go and sit on his throne, and it's really, really cool. And you know, he sort of tries to build a new Rome in what is today Aachen. Well, it's in Aachen, but Aachen's one of those places that's been in different places, you know, because Europe never has standard borders for very long. But it's basically in no man's land between what is today France and Germany. So it's in, I think it's in the Low Country. But I think, well, where's the capital of the EU? Belgium? Is that right?
Brussels.
I think it may be
Brussels.
Brussels. So you've got almost Brussels is kind of repeating that, right? It's like they're kind of going back to the land of Charlemagne, you know, to sort of try to recreate a uniform Europe. In the midst of all of this, there's lots of interesting things happening. The Vikings, like I say, you know, they eventually become evangelized, and then they become missionaries. You know, then they become great missionaries. And then they found cities, and in what's going on in Britain, you've got, which is great stuff. You've got the sort of Danelaw line, between, because the Danes come to York and they push west, and then you've got the Anglo-Saxons, and they're pushed almost all the way to Wales, and then they begin to push the Vikings out, and then there becomes kind of a line in the middle of England that is, part of it is Danelaw, and part of it is common law. And eventually, these people become a nation. So you've got invasions that are happening, and then ultimately, they're initially violent, and they're ultimately end up in some kind of peace. And then there's a kind of new thing that evolves out of that. But Rome is invading, Islam is trying to invade Rome. Rome is the catch. When all the when Muslim armies want to take prizes, Rome is the huge prize. And they go by different names. They go by the Saracens, sometimes they're called. It's the same reality that we deal with today in the middle of militarism. So Alfred the Great, we talked a little bit about him. He's the Anglo-Saxon who pushed back against the Vikings. And then in the east, you've got Cyril and Methodius, and they're going in to Central Europe, and they're beginning to evangelize that place, taking the written gospel. And everywhere the missionaries go, they bring literacy, right? And so that's a huge part of what we do as Catholics. Because we love the Lord, because we are worship, and because we read, and because the scriptures are so important, literacy is a huge part of where we go. Rollo, the Norseman, is settling in Normandy. That's going to be a big deal because eventually William the Conqueror is his descendant, and he will eventually take England. But again, Islam will attack, then it'll get pushed back. Then it'll attack, and then push back. It'll get attacked, and it'll push back. A long, long history of that. In the year 936, we have, in the early 900s, we have Otto. And Charlemagne, he kind of took the whole emperor thing seriously when he wanted to. But Otto is the one who sort of brings together what's called the Holy Roman Empire. So Otto is, he's following in the footsteps of Charlemagne, but he's kind of making what had been kind of an idea something more real. And one of his wives, Adelaide, is depicted in one of our stained glass windows in the parish. Kind of interesting. But, and this is really important because the Holy Roman Empire, sometimes you'll hear people trash it, they'll say it's not a Holy nor Roman. And in a sense, it's not the old Roman Empire, but it is that idea, right? Because the Roman Empire had kind of outgrown its geographical sort of center. And so it's the same idea, and it's Holy Roman Empire because this is a time, when everybody's Catholic. And that's going to bring some order and much needed sort of structure, even more so as Europe begins to sort of stabilize after all these crises, and after all these invasions, and after all these difficulties. One of the things that happens in all of this is that Catholics imagined that the Lord would return in the year 1000. And so, they didn't really build nice churches. They were just sort of hanging on because they knew the Lord was going to come back. And he's going to come back in the year 1000. And then in 1001, they said, oh, okay. It's like, I guess we have to, start taking this seriously and move forward. And so you're going to see a kind of renaissance. You've already seen a little bit of one with Carolingians, because he brings the learning from England and from Britain and from Ireland, and he begins schools and he begins, but you're going to start seeing great architecture after the year 1070. There was a kind of expectation of the Lord's return, and when he did not return in the year 1000, it was kind of a new chapter in Europe. And Otto, I think, is part of that, right? In Kiev, which was big time in the news today, there's St. Olga, and a lot of you might actually be descended from her. She is she's a really interesting figure in Ukrainian history, and she is no wallflower. Like, she was as violent and as rough and as tough as you could possibly be, but she ends up becoming Catholic. And this is, of course, before the split between the East and the West, right? And one of her descendants will be Margaret of Scotland. So she she's in a lot of the royal family lines. So her offspring, when I say a lot of you may be descended from her, because she had offspring that went everywhere. Because, every daughter would get married to another dynasty, and so they just spread, and she lives so long ago that a lot of us are actually descended from Olga. But this is why, incidentally, Ukraine is so important in Vladimir Putin's sort of estimation, because, Moscow likes to pretend that it's the important sea, but the original place of that Slavic people that took the faith was not Moscow, it was Kiev, or Kiev. And there's Vladimir the Great being baptized. I might actually be close to the anniversary of his baptism. Okay, so what's going to happen next is we're going to start to see, sadly, this. And the Western Rite and the Eastern Rites, plural, they divide early on, but there's a charitable connection, and there's a sacramental connection. But as the East becomes more sophisticated and then becomes kind of lost into Islam, they start to look at first with contempt and then somewhat with envy to the West. And the West develops its own way. And so the West is developing its liturgy in Latin, and in the East they're maintaining or developing their liturgies in other languages, right? Not Latin, in Greek, and in Cyrillic, and these other languages that are very ancient sometimes, but they're not Latin. So that's where you start to hear about the Latin Rite Catholic Church. And the Latin Rite Catholic Church basically looked to the Holy Father and as a kind of simple point of reference. If you were in communion with Rome, you were in the Catholic Church. That was your sort of telltale for you to be part of the church, the apostolic church that was founded by Jesus Christ. Whereas in the East, you have these churches that even today they may not be in communion with each other, right? So like this church and that church in the East, they may all sort of be fighting amongst themselves. So there's a less of
unity in the East. And what's going to happen, in the East sadly, is Constantinople was the sort of glue that held these confederations of apostolic churches together. But soon, very soon, Islam is going to take over Constantinople, and you're going to have a whole other chapter. And at that point, there's a real power shift, right? Because Christianity becomes almost in shambles in places in the East, and yet in the West, despite all of the difficulties, and there are many, there's a kind of order that's evolving in Western Europe. And that is going to benefit the whole world. Whereas, just like before, Ireland had been like this farthest place you could go to on the outer skirts of nowhere, and yet that place became instrumental, those people became instrumental even in the last 100 years of evangelizing Europe and the world. In a similar way, Europe, Western Europe, which had been kind of scrappy and falling apart and struggling, it's going to get organized in such a way that it can begin to re-evangelize the world. Go into sub-Saharan Africa, go farther into the East. So you're going to begin to see sort of this organizational period in the West. But it's kind of a sad moment, but it's also, it brings us to the point of where we start talking about the Roman Catholic Church, right? And where we can't look to the East at all because the East has lost its power. How are we on time? Did we get
47 minutes.
That's good. Let's just open some questions because I don't want to slip into the next 1,000 years. We have to wait for that. But again, it's a broad way of looking at the history, right? And there's so many great stories in all of that. And there's so many stories we're not telling in all of that are really worth knowing. And, think about your own heritage. Probably everybody in this room has probably about 15 different, heritages. If you trace them back, it's like nobody's like 100% anything, right? Mostly Americans, maybe some of you are, but even if you are 100% Italian, for many years, it's not like the Italian, there's so much history that you need to learn from your own family line that I think is really important for you to know, but also for you to teach. Irish Catholics have a great story. Italian Catholics have a great story. Portuguese Catholics have a great story. Spanish Catholics. What are those stories? And how we should know this. But some of us, at least I am, I'm a little bit of Baptist and a little everything. So I have a million different backgrounds. But anybody have any questions? Yes.
Back then, and even not that long ago, popes would live and die, come and go. And the average peasantry might not even know who the Pope was. And now at the speed of almost light, the Pope and his minions in the Vatican have direct and immediate influence everywhere they're used to do that in the world.
Right. Comment? Are you
willing to comment
on that?
Teeing you up, what would you say?
I think that was a better way.
It's a loaded question, I know.
Yes, it's a loaded question. We've had some very good popes. And with very good popes, our tendency is to say, whatever the Pope says is good. But if we look back at our history, we'll say, we've had some real stinkers too. And sometimes it was good that they didn't have a microphone, you know, and that they were preoccupied with painting a ceiling, so that they didn't know. So a pope's job, if he understands his job, is to speak little and to settle conflicts and to be a brother to all, and not to be confusing, not to be ambiguous, but to be clear, and really not to be innovative. Popes are not supposed to be innovative. You know, they're just supposed to be like the old grandpa back in Rome who reminds us who we are when we get all sort of agitated out in the hinterlands and we're fighting, and the Pope says, "I will now speak," and we'll listen, and we go, "Okay." Yeah, that's really the role of the papacy. But of late, it's become something of it's almost taken the place of the bishops. In fact, it's taking authority away from pastors and bishops now. So, but that's not the way it has traditionally been understood.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I shouldn't be going around saying, well, if I was Pope, here's what I would do. So,
Well, you could say that, Tom, but you're not saying.
Thank you, Father.
Yeah.
So but I do have a real question. You talked about the Dark Ages, and you mentioned about the volcano and the plague and all that, and then you mentioned a little bit about the Middle Ages, maybe even touched on the High Middle Ages.
We're about to sort of wander into the High Middle Ages, yeah.
Right, and so besmirchingly, the church is called, the church wants to take us back to the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
And so can you put a little clarity to that aspect of where we're often besmirched and in light of some of the things you touched on?
We will eventually get to that. Yes, I can.
Okay.
We are a post-Enlightenment society, right? The Enlightenment is something that began really as a kind of Christian humanistic approach, but evolved into a kind of secular thing. And it was a prideful thing. And what's going to happen is Rome, the papacy is going to go to France for a while, and then it's going to be brought back to Rome, and then there's going to be a Renaissance. And you're going to see coming out of the Renaissance the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, which, let's just say, it's not always forever focused in France, it's also happening in Scotland and in England and even in the Empire. But it tends to be a secular perspective. And it calls itself the Enlightenment as a kind of, we're not dark like those Dark Ages. So it tries, and we use the language because history kind of forces us to use the Enlightenment. But really the Enlightenment is a very ultimately ends up being a very anti-Christian, anti-Catholic idea.
So that's really 2 lectures from now, so I should just say...
Well, it's okay, I asked for questions, so yeah, that's what it's about.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the volcano. Do we know where the volcano was?
Oh,
That's
yes.
my question.
I think it's Iceland.
Oh, Iceland, yeah.
I think it's Iceland, yeah. And,
Well, that happened recently, too.
well, let me just see, because I have it written here.
We had planes shut down because you couldn't fly because it was too smoky because of the Icelandic. I don't remember what year that was.
I remember because I was in Europe, and I had just gotten back, and then they stopped the planes. It was kind of, I say I remember, I don't remember, but I remember the event. I'm pretty sure it was in Iceland. I'll have to look it up. But you can find, I know that they find evidence of it in Iceland, because they did core samples of the glaciers. They find like all of this, it's interesting too, because
Iceland.
I'm sorry?
Iceland.
It is in Iceland, yeah. But those, like there's a huge volcano under Yosemite National Park, basically 8 states in the West, that one day could go kaboom and would throw us into another dark age, right? So I mean, we sort of wander around thinking everything's going to be wonderful, but one good solo flare could mess us up for quite a bit. So. But, that's one of the reasons I think the church continues to sort of evangelize as she does through liturgy. These are the tried, honored ways in which we've passed on the traditions and conveyed those truths to our children. So, anybody have? Yes, sir.
I'm not such a question, but a comment on the Dark Ages is that I know I've read that the church was what actually preserved a lot of the knowledge and history from the Romans, from the pagan Romans.
That is correct.
The only reason that we have that today is because the church held on to it through the Dark Ages, through all
That is
the
correct.
religions.
And a lot of times people will mistakenly say that Islam did it, and that's not true, right? It's like those libraries were preserved in monasteries, and it was not easy, because again, the Vikings would come and burn them all, So, how those books survived. Like, we have something called the Didache. The Didache, we know that the Didache existed because people quoted from the Didache. The Didache is as old, probably, as St. John's Gospel. It was almost in the Bible. It goes back to the time of James the Just. But we had lost that document for 1,800 years almost, until somebody found a copy of it and said, aha, here's the Didache. And now we can read the Didache. So, sometimes very important documents were preserved, because of a handwritten manuscript that got stuck behind a bookshelf in an abbey somewhere, that they repainted the building or had to put in plumbing or electricity, and they found it. And that, it's remarkable how civilization sometimes hangs on, just by one manuscript. Right? Yes?
Just a quick question on why do you think Muhammad was so successful so quickly?
I think it's the violence, right? The violence. Because as a missionary going from Ireland to the mainland Europe, like Boniface, he's not married, he's not going to buy a house, he's going to go into a place without a weapon and probably get martyred to try to begin to change people's hearts. Whereas if you're a Muslim trying to spread the religion at the time, you're going to go with a sword, kill people, take their stuff. So there's an advantage to that kind of conversion. Sorry to say, yes?
More a comment than a question. You touched on Columba founding Iona.
Right.
And through all your talk, you showed where different parts of Europe became the center of intellectual gathering, holding of the documents. There's a great book, How the Irish Saved Western Civilization, because all of the books were moved out of Rome to Ireland. And the Celtic cross that was in that picture also ties back to pagan life.
Well,
So
the
it's
cross
the sun.
the cross that survives there is the cross to St. Martin, which is great. But there were scores of stone sandy crosses on Iona that were all pushed down by the Presbyterians, later. So you go through periods of time where we're being settled on by barbarians, but you also where the Christians themselves are destroying things. But Iona is a great example. I mean, so many of the high kings of Scotland are buried there. It's just a very beautiful place, a very important place. But again, if you went there now, you'd be like sheep. There are sheep and there's wind. and yet it was the center of the intellectual life of the church. For a long time.
Where do you say that is now, that intellectual center?
Well, I think with the
Of our
internet,
church.
and I think it's kind of, it's harder to wipe out, I think we're going to probably wipe out Christianity ourselves from within, more so than being set upon. But, I don't know, the intellectual, I would say, it's hard to say. That's a good question. And I don't know the answer to that question. So much, I would say that Europe was so important for a very long time. Right now, what's going on with the Senate in Germany, it's